Hello, everyone, and welcome to our August Seekers session. I hope you're having a very good weekend. And let's say hi to Jay Cobley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, this month we're going to be talking about love as the masterpiece of nature, and looking at the power of love in all of its forms as a natural phenomenon that's as ubiquitous and necessary as gravity. The power of love is as formidable as electromagnetism and the strong and weak nuclear forces that sustain life in the known universe. We inquire into why love is held to be the crowning jewel of a meaningful life, and at how the practice of loving, opening your heart to another person, actually impacts the process of awakening. Now, this inquiry into love is going to necessitate a good deal of excavation, because the term love has been so bastardized and overused that its genuine meaning has nearly been lost. We live in a romance-addicted, sentimental age when love is exploited as a commodity, a brand, to sell everything from cigarettes to Viking cruises to little blue pills for improving your sex life. The love brand generates monumental profits for corporations that seek to capitalize on our insatiable human desire for connection. Some of the questions we'll explore may, in fact, challenge your cherished beliefs about love and how it is that love can coexist with emotions that are completely antithetical to its expression. Things like jealousy, envy, status-seeking, aggression, the desire to possess or to be possessed by another, or to exploit love as a kind of camouflage for loneliness. Bastardizations like these have very little to do with what love actually is. Love is a universal power that is infinitely greater than the packages we use to contain it, the forms and the shapes that love may take in one's life. We're going to discover that love is in fact transpersonal. Love is a metaphysical power that is never finally bound by its forms. Although we express love through our physical form, of course, and use the body and emotions, our flesh and blood empathy, affection, and care to share it with others, we are in fact nothing more than channels for a force that is transcendental. Now, if this sounds like a paradox, that's because it is. On the physical, human level, love does require form to come into the world, as water can't be passed around without a container. But these forms are no ultimate limitation. One container is no better than another, in fact. Your dog's irrepressible devotion is composed of the same stuff, the same energetic power, as the love you show toward your children, your partner, your friends, or yourself. It is all one love issuing from a single source, no matter how it manifests in the world. Now, many would disagree with this premise. I think of them as anthro-supremacists, people who hold the belief that humans are of another order entirely from the so-called lower animals. They will tell you that human love is sui generis. It's completely unique. It's a loftier, more valuable phenomenon than the tail-wagging ardor of your devoted puppy. They will try to convince you that because of your brain size and variables such as imagination, aspiration, intentionality, longing, and so on, human love is a thing apart, right? Because we bond in such complex, dramatic ways, they will tell you, it makes no sense to compare the epic range of human love with mere animal magnetism. I will argue that this human-centered proposition actually confuses the form with the content. When you focus on how love is packaged, the form through which it's expressed, it is all too easy to forget its spiritual dimension, including the power of love to unite, to simplify, and to redeem everything that it touches. Now, this may sound idealistic, but it really isn't. The transformative power of love is a metaphysical fact. Transcending the dimension of psychology, the mixed bag of our neuroses and expectations and fears, it is entirely possible to become aware of the current of love, a surging river of fellow feeling that is actually buoying us up at all times. Though the forms of love always have conditions and limits, love itself is neither fragile nor illusory. Love isn't some will-o'-the-wisp that disappears the second you turn your back, or say the wrong thing, or fail to live up to some standard of love created by the culture in which you live. It is more like the very air that you're breathing that sustains you at every moment. Most of us don't wake up in the morning afraid that there won't be enough air to breathe or sufficient gravity to support us. We don't move through our lives filled with trepidation that gravity will suddenly collapse and drop us into oblivion. Instead, we trust gravity to be there to keep us upright because that's how the universe works, and we belong to this creation. The question is, can we realistically take the same approach to love? Is it possible to trust that love is there, that all you need to do is take it in, be nourished by it, and exhale it for others to utilize as well? Meditation is a useful way of approaching this question. When we meditate, we breathe in energy from what might be called the love field, and then let it out again. We learn to savor what Buddhists call the one taste of being, when the heart is open and the mind becomes still. Practicing metta or loving kindness meditation, for example, we come to see how much this love field becomes obscured or covered over by intense emotions. Emotions are a vehicle for love, of course, but they can also make it inaccessible when there is a prevalence of conflict or excitement or fear. Swept up in a current of powerful feeling, it's easy to lose your moorings in love, to lose track of your orientation and even your ethics. You stumble into a kind of hall of mirrors where you hardly recognize yourself, where wrong is right and up is down, and nothing quite makes sense anymore. There's a madness that goes along with love when it's fixated on an object of desire. For example, last week when I was in Portugal, I was at a museum and I came across a very beautiful white marble sculpture that captured this duality very beautifully. It was a piece called Love and Folly, and it showed Cupid as a laughing cherubic baby on its back, holding the head of a nasty-looking demon that was meant to represent the craziness of love. This popular notion of love going hand in hand with madness is deeply entrenched in Western culture. This image of love is poignant, dramatic, and often quite beautiful, and points to the process of trying to, as W.H. Auden put it, love our crooked neighbor with our crooked heart. But this pop understanding of love should not deceive us into believing that this is as good as love gets, that love and selfishness are inextricably bound together, any more than suffering as a choice, an add-on to life's inevitable pain, is an inevitable part of being human. The goal of spirituality, of course, is to put that myth to rest. As seekers, our goal is to alleviate unnecessary suffering by waking up to our own illusions and overcoming the tragic tendency to mistake appearances for reality and to choose story, our interpretation of things, with the truth. That's our tragedy. When you recognize love's metaphysical quality, you become awed by its power to break through limits. And that's why the spectacle of someone showing love toward an enemy or exhibiting kindness in circumstances of extreme adversity is so extraordinary and transformative. When the parents of children murdered in school shootings forgive their killers, or the widows of black men tortured and killed during South African apartheid visit the white supremacists in prison and allow them to pour out their hearts in contrition, we glimpse this transformative power in action and are changed by its beauty, spiritually, psychologically, and even physically. There's a lot of science showing that elevation, which is the term for the kind of contagious, uplifting feeling we get when we witness demonstrations of love, brings a variety of positive changes in a life. Elicited by acts of virtue or moral beauty, it causes warm, open feelings to happen in us, what the psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls a dilation in the chest. And it motivates people to behave more virtuously themselves. As Ralph Waldo Emerson tells us, to be human is to be, quote, put in training for a love which knows not sex, nor person, nor partiality, unquote. It is then that love fulfills its true purpose, which is to push us past our personal limits and to dissolve the false separation between self and other. Spiritual love exceeds the sum of its parts. It transcends form, what Emerson calls the scaffolding on which we build our stories about love, which have actually very little to do with love itself. Marriage is another excellent example of how love over time comes to reveal its own essence. Spouses who stay together come to see that the things by which they were most enchanted, what Emerson calls those once sacred features, that magical play of charms, were in fact deciduous, meaning seasonal. As they fall away, the scaffolding on which the house was built comes to reveal itself. In marriages that endure, spouses come to realize, in Emerson's words, that, quote, the purification of the intellect and the heart from year to year is the real marriage, foreseen and prepared from the first and wholly above their consciousness, unquote. Isn't that beautiful? Let me just repeat that. The purification of the intellect and the heart from year to year is the real marriage, foreseen and prepared from the first and wholly above their consciousness. Beyond their outward relationship, in other words, couples, indeed anybody who opens her heart to another person, come to learn that beyond their outer relationship, they're actually having another relationship completely, a kind of soul relationship. While they're taking out the trash or talking about TV or what to do with the kids, spouses are actually engaged in a spiritual process of which most of them are unaware. Seen through this bigger lens, relationships take on a quite different meaning. What constitutes success or failure changes. The questions become, how are we freed or awakened by love? We come to ask ourselves whether it's through happiness or struggle, through security or loss, that we are changed by love. Because there are important lessons to be learned from both. What's good for the spirit may be inimical to the ego, which tends to want what it wants when it wants it. As the philosopher Plotinus said 2,000 years ago, love refines and purifies the soul. And as we all know, pain and purification sometimes go hand in hand. How else to loosen the grip of the maniac ego that's protecting its dominion by avoiding pain? But it isn't love that's doing the hurting, and this is very important. Love is making it possible to dissolve the part of ourselves that withdraws, shuts down, plays it safe, goes silent, or otherwise evades the process of dying to the self in order to know the other. Now, death is an unfortunate word, but it's very common in spiritual circles to talk about ego death. So instead, let's call it ego relinquishment. To die, something must be real, and the ego isn't real. It's a conglomeration of ideas that are clustered around the idea of me or the personal self, the little I. In fact, relinquishing this rigid sense of self opens the valve for love to flow. And this isn't rocket science. When you open, you love. When you close, you die. But that doesn't mean you need to do it mindlessly. It's foolish to open outwardly in circumstances of imminent danger, for example. It's unskillful, if not stupid, to pour your generosity out in demonstrable ways to those who have harmed you or who cause you great pain. But your heart can remain open nevertheless. Underneath your circumspection, your boundaries, it's possible to remain entirely open, transparent, generous, and full of blessings for the being of the other. Loving and choosing not to be in outward relationship are not counterindicated. Let me repeat that. Loving and choosing not to be in relationship, outward relationship, aren't counterindicated. In fact, in my opinion, we would be wise to do a lot more of such pruning, especially as we get older, not only for our own sakes, but also for the sake of the people we're in relationship to. Because insincerity wounds both parties. The person clinging to a one-sided relationship is actually best put out of their misery. Which brings us to the question of truthfulness and love, and where morality belongs in the act of loving. This is a very complex topic. Is it loving to tell your partner that he looks fat in the outfit he's wearing to go to a meeting once he has one foot out the door? Is it loving to dredge up ancient sexual peccadillos in the name of confession and living in the truth? Or, as I would suggest, do we lack subtlety in the art of loving? Do we impose puritanical ideals on relationship and maintain impossible expectations of those we love, expecting them to fill in the holes in us that will never be filled as long as we live? Think of how much better our relationships would be if we understood our own holes, our own gaps, what an alcoholic friend of mine calls the God-sized hole at the center of his heart. Because intimacy accelerates neurosis. No sooner are you close to someone than the hungry ghost comes raging to the surface. Feed me, love me, fill me, tell me I'm good, worthy, enough. Promise me you'll never leave me and that nothing will ever change between us. In other words, assume the mantle of responsibility for my happiness, because that is what people in love are supposed to do, in quotes. It's very important that we survey and understand our own emptiness, our own void, before we get into relationships, if possible. Because so much damage can be avoided that way, by knowing the damaged parts of yourself that can cause you to behave so monstrously when fear begins to set in. Take the issue of reciprocity. Most relationship experts will tell you that reciprocity is mandatory in relationships where love is present. They will tell you to keep a kind of internal scorecard to stop from giving more than you get. But this tit-for-tat approach to love can actually become quite self-centered and superficial and limiting. It doesn't speak to the needs of the spirit or to the soul's refinement and purification. Instead, it's a kind of capitalist approach to love that focuses on return on investment and protecting an imaginary self with its paranoid imaginary needs and its terror of being exposed. That approach to love is intended to keep us ahead of the game, so to speak, whether we're talking about romance or love in families or among friends. Emerson puts it this way, quote, "Why should I cumber myself with regrets that the receiver is not capacious? It never troubles the sun that some of its rays fall wide and vain into ungrateful space, and only a small part on the reflecting planet." Let me repeat that. Why should I cumber myself with regrets that the receiver is not capacious? It never troubles the sun that some of its rays fall wide and vain into ungrateful space, and only a small part on the reflecting planet. In other words, instead of worrying about what we're not getting, we can use our own strength, what Emerson calls our own greatness, to educate the crude and cold companion. In other words, by being brave, by being courageous and generous in relationship, we can give the other person permission and the courage and the example of how to do the same. Emerson goes on to say that it is thought a disgrace to love unrequited, but the great will tell you that true love cannot be unrequited. Right? True love cannot be unrequited. And when you reflect on this, it liberates you. You no longer see love as a commodity to be measured or lost or bartered like a trophy or a prize. Freed of its possessive, competitive disguises, love becomes a gift that can genuinely be given only when it's free. The Stoics called this sympathia, which is the affinity of parts to the organic whole. And they suggested that sympathia, or love, is actually a portal to self-realization. Sympathia is the artery of interconnection that gives us access to our full humanity. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, quote, "The universe made rational creatures for the sake of each other, with an eye toward mutual benefit based on true value and never for harm." He went on to say that what is bad for the hive is bad for the bee. So love and survival are actually one thing. They are inextricably bound together. Without the ability to know one another, as it says in the Quran, we actually miss our opportunity in this lifetime. The Quran tells us that God created male and female and races and tribes in order that we may know one another. But robbed of such knowledge and the love of others, we actually begin to wither. We start to weaken. We lose our life force. Everything in nature, Emerson says, has its existence so connected with other beings that if set apart from them, it would instantly perish. Insulate a man and you annihilate him. He cannot unfold, he cannot live without a world, Emerson tells us. So isolation is actually the enemy of love. What separates solitude from isolation is self-love and the intention to benefit from being alone. That's because solitude, unlike isolation, is voluntary and temporary. Isolation is something else entirely, as all of the research on the epidemic of loneliness today shows. Isolation is associated with death, not life, and starvation, not plenty. And as Americans in an individualistic culture, we see very clearly the shadow of this cowboy ideal, the ideal of the rugged individualist. The shadow of that ideal is loneliness. And yet, our society actually gives us very mixed messages when it comes to love and sympathia. Dependency is too often viewed as weakness in the harsh climate of American meritocracy. Whether we're talking about personal relationships or the social contract, exaggerated fears of dependency are anathema to love. This is very important. Generosity and vulnerability are too often given short shrift because it takes a strong person to ask for help and to trust that she will be supported by others. To trust that there's enough love in the air to support her, enough gravity, that she won't fall if she reaches out, even when that love comes from strangers. The humility needed to express personal needs actually increases self-reliance and our own awakening. It's fear and hubris that obscure love or sympathia. The heart remains cramped in its bud until we allow ourselves to open to kindness. So relationships change, affections alter, grief comes and goes, but the filament binding humanity together remains as strong as ever. We are here to witness and love one another during our brief time here on earth.
So that's what I wanted to say to you today about love being the masterpiece of nature. And now, Jay, why don't you pull up the card and we'll do some writing. Here we go. I'd like you, please, to take 20 minutes now to describe an experience that showed you the metaphysical nature of love, an experience that showed you that love is metaphysical. What set it apart and how did it change you? Be as specific as you can be, please. 10 minutes in, Jay will open up the breakout rooms if you would like to join a group. Otherwise, just keep on writing for the full 20 minutes. Good luck.